What's up, Trekkies? It's your boy Wil Wofford here with Trekker's Delight, a Star Trek-inspired podcast. Before we get started, we're going to give away $100, so make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to our channel where we will announce the lucky winner every single week. Now, welcome to Trekker's Delight.
Welcome to the 5th episode of Techno Trek. Today I'm joined by Lord Deathman, and we're going to be discussing all of the crazy goodness involved in the ramifications, the profound ramifications of Star Trek on our society. Are you ready, Lord Deathman?
I am totally ready. Thank you for giving me such a warm welcome. I am excited to talk Trek technology today.
Yeah, me too. It's we've been developing these ideas, and really the ethos of this whole thing has been something that you've encapsulated, and we'll throw to it in the introduction. But if you could just introduce or fundamentally sort of explain the impetus for some of this conversation.
Wow, that is challenging, but I will try to dig deep into our thesis without being overly verbose. But I think in the modern era of Trek, there's been a huge focus on community, connectedness, diversity. And I think that what gets lost in the discussion is probably the technology. And I think a part of Gene Roddenberry's vision of utopia with humanity in it largely relies on the technology that he created. It was this incredible framework of devices and concepts that kind of allowed us to mature as a species. So I was kind of excited to kind of talk about that because I feel so much of the current Star Trek discussion is really centered around the personalities on the show and how diverse it is. And I'm totally for a progressive Star Trek. I support all of those kinds of ideas. Mm-hmm. But I do think that I want to help people get into the fandom who might be intimidated by the technology, sort of talk about the ideas plainly and what kind of effects do they have on society in this, speculative future.
That was so good. I love that. That was so good. It's so true. And I would resonate with that. And although I don't want to underscore or undercut any of the politics or issues that are like being brought into it, and of course these are reflections of our current society and culture, and how these things are sort of feeding back, art imitating life, imitating art sort of thing. As a platform, Star Trek to me was also about fundamentally what was humanity able to do when it stepped on even higher shoulders than where we are now technologically. So, when you talk about some of the fantastic advanced technology in the Star Trek world, what would inevitably happen to our society and to us, the biological organisms, as we had a feedback with all of this stuff. So in our conversations, and we're going to get to the intro now, I'm going to start to talk about some of the specific technologies we're going to get into. Like, the overarching theme of this episode is, what are the profound ramifications that the integration of these advanced technologies has had on us as a population and across other populations? So I will cut to the intro.
Got it.
We are. And I'm joined by, of course, Lord Deathman in this episode of Techno Trek. This is, of course, brought to you under the umbrella of Trekker's Delight. Don't forget to like and subscribe and comment. We love to hear your comments. And the introductory statement that started it off for us was the ramifications of having such advanced technology on human civilization. There's lots of civilizations in the Star Trek world, but specifically we're going to talk about human civilization. Can you read the introduction, please?
So the future set world of Star Trek is frequently depicted as a quasi-utopia where humanity is unburdened by the ills of scarcity and hatred and greed and inequality. One of the most significant contributing factors to that state of this future society is its advanced technology. So on today's show, we definitely want to discuss some of the fantastic technology of Star Trek and how it shaped Gene Roddenberry's vision of humanity.
Which is amazing. I love the quasi utopia. It
It's
touches
not
on.
quite a utopia. It's not quite perfect, but it's a little more perfect than what we've got going on today.
It's so interesting, and I would love to cut to that also. Is that like, I think in our current world we sometimes think of as technology. If only we had these advanced medicines, if only if we had these things, then everything would be okay. But at our core, what is it that we really like? When you gave a bow and arrow to cavemen who had clubs, did they get better?
Right.
It's the same sort of thing. The first technology that we're going to be discussing today is transporters. What
Yay.
is, yeah, Lord Deathman, what are transporters for our audience?
Well, a transporter in the world of Star Trek is a theoretical device which converts matter to energy. And once it is converted into energy, it can translocate that energy to another location. So, you as a human being, you step on a transporter pad, your organic solid matter is transformed into energy and then beamed, is the parlance we use in the Trek world, to another location. That location could be feet away, it could be miles away, it could be light years away, depending on the strength of the device. And you are then reconverted back into matter.
Oh, amazing. Um, things to take into account are like the energy requirements, because it just seems so prohibitively energy. Think of
Yeah,
the
it
equation.
seems like an expensive device in terms of the light bill, for sure.
Yeah, we must have access to just huge, huge energy abilities to do those sorts of things because the conversion of matter to energy, the very famous equation E equals mc squared, that as the mass increases, you need to multiply by the speed of light squared. It just becomes so infinitely impossible to reach those. It's the same reason that you can't time travel or bend space, but we're getting around those things. For instance, with the Alcubierre device, whatever, not creating a warp static bubble and then pushing the universe around it rather than actually, there's workarounds for these sorts of things. I wonder if there's a workaround for the transporter, but otherwise the actual equation for the energy is ridiculous. The actual numbers, they don't really jive. So
Right.
that's something that always bothered me in mathematically.
Yeah.
But let's put that aside.
Right. Right.
I
This
just
is all speculative.
yes, we came up with some pros and cons for each of the things we're going to talk about transporters first. Like let's talk about some of the positive impacts that these transporters would have had on our current world. Specifically, first with this
Yeah, it
one here.
transforms Earth into a global city. And, just contemplating that for a moment, let's say you have a transporter on this planet and you can create multiple transporter portals or stations. I mean, it would revolutionize transportation, even in your local city. I'm sure we still have buses and automobiles, and I'm sure we still have personal transportation like bicycles and motorcycles. But the reality of the Star Trek universe is that you could wake up in London, have breakfast, and then by mid morning, you could be hanging out with your friends in Mumbai just by being
Right.
transported there. You could stop in, say hello to a relative, and then, you're in Louisiana at your next transport. So I think the world goes from a place where it takes hours and hours to get somewhere, or you're having to make all of these very precise plans for travel to far distances, like say from New York to Australia, that becomes incidental now, and the world becomes less large and becomes kind of a city. It's every place on Earth finally becomes your neighborhood, and that's a concept that's extremely fascinating to me. And I wonder what human beings of the Star Trek era would think and feel about the idea. They're probably just taking it for granted that you could probably do 8 or 9 locations on the globe in one day. I
Yeah,
don't know if they're. Do you think they're rationing out like transporter credits for the day?
there
Probably
is.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's I don't know how it works in their citizenry or whatever, but there is an episode of, I can't remember what it was. I think it was DS9, where he says that yeah, he's talking to his son about his when he was in the academy, and he said I must have used a month's worth of transporter like a
Credits,
year's,
right,
yeah.
right. To
And
go
he,
home because he was going from San Francisco back to Louisiana every night to
yeah,
be with his parents.
yeah,
Yeah, you're right. You know what? So you do have a finite allocation, but still,
allocation.
you can definitely make the most of that in terms of seeing a lot of the world in a day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Imagine like, some kind of work versus other kinds of work, maybe like unlimited versus allocated. And I don't know how that works stepwise in their society, but the fact that there are allocations also lends itself to saying that it isn't unlimited type
Right,
of transport. Yeah.
right.
Which would change the way that we're seeing it. So if it is somewhat limited, you are thinking more about where more thoughtfully and how long you'll be there and that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, and I know you can kind of make this world itinerary for a day, but you're right. You're definitely going to be thinking, well, maybe I want to see my uncle here, maybe I want to go shopping here, maybe I want to do some alone time here during the day. But you
Yeah.
do have to manage that daily, weekly, monthly allocation, however it goes. Yeah,
Totally. So yes, that is definitely a positive ramification.
yeah,
There are philosophies of like the loss of nation states and about the idea of being able to own property, like ownership, and property ownership as an ideal and stuff could be flattened with
right.
with an idea like this. So because imagine you are a citizen in this world, and now you can go anywhere. As you said, anywhere can become your neighborhood, your backyard. You're not really stuck to a nation state anymore in the same way. So I think there would be a diversity in our populations that would be before to
Yeah,
never seen. Yeah,
yeah, changing things culturally. You're not necessary.
totally,
It's a probably a transcultural environment. You're in
totally.
a hip hop cipher in New Mombasa, and then you're going off to say New York to hang out and catch some ballet. So on the sort of hierarchy of needs, we're always thinking in terms of humans about our bucket list. I want to get to see the Ayers Rock in Australia, and that's something we have to plan for. And sometimes things like that take years to get off the ground to happen. But now in Star Trek's future, you can do it almost instantaneously, which
Mhm.
means that need has been fulfilled in the hierarchy. And, I would imagine that a human living in this future speculative world can now kind of focus on larger issues that
Yeah,
they don't have to have this bucket list kind of at the back of their mind all the time.
totally. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next point that we have here. Can you read it for us? I'm
Yeah.
going to tell you to read them all.
The second point, also endlessly fascinating. It would provide an unprecedented safety apparatus with the ability to transport a person or persons away from life-threatening situations almost instantaneously. That's referred to once again in Star Trek nomenclature as an emergency beam out, right? The old EBO. And if you put that even in today's context with a self-driving car, which we are only beginning to be able to master, and without naming names in the automotive industry, some of those cars are having problems, right? They're crashing into things, and
Yes.
humans are getting hurt or even worse. So taking the transporter technology and keeping a sustained lock on someone, during a hazardous activity, and the ability to pull them out milliseconds before something like that could happen, a car accident, a bus accident. I mean, that must be increasing the longevity of human beings. They're not as many freak accidents that
Hmm.
that harm a large group of people. I know they still happen in Gene Roddenberry's future, but they're probably not that common anymore. And yeah, this allows people to sort of go about their daily tasks with a little bit more confidence, a little
Yeah.
less anxiety. What do you think?
I mean, I agree with everything you said. I'm trying to think about like specific tasks or jobs. So you'd have like a transition culture. And also remembering like Enterprise when they were first bringing those things online. And at first it was for like non biological things. And then they were like tepidly trying to do with like people and their first beam out. And it's really fun actually to see that part of Enterprise where they're trying the transporters for the
Right.
first time and they're really freaked out about it. But as they get more comfortable with it, they start to rely on it more and more. And so the idea that you need to physically pick them up in a shuttle becomes less and less. And so, like in a military sense or in the Starfleet sense, whatever, it's infinitely it's such an important
Yeah.
thing, because you can now whisk your people away like effortlessly from dangerous situations. I think it would profoundly also change our culture of like labor on planet Earth,
Yeah.
and in just
That's
those
a good
ways.
one.
Yeah, I think you would have like a different labor class, and they would have like a like you wouldn't have as many accidents, and people would be more likely to engage in labor, like for its positive and therapeutic effects. Like less,
Right.
yeah, I think that labor would become just another part of like the mosaic, and then having less and less, like, because people die doing labor. You're
Yeah.
less likely to die in like a white collar job than a blue collar job. And so I think that it would become part of, I was just thinking about that now, like with the idea that you have trained a lock on someone, or that we all have locks on us, like on the planet, and like, oh, this person's having a heart attack. They're immediately being transported to
Right.
the
To a medical
hospital.
facility. Yeah.
All of those things would become like part and parcel. What do you
There
think?
is an episode of TNG with Picard where he contemplates giving up being a captain for a while in order to go work on a project that's located under the sea. And I think they were building some kind of a habitat under the ocean. I forget the
Hmm.
details, but it struck me that that's a hazardous environment to work in. You're still dealing with the pressures of the ocean.
Hmm.
Structural integrity on a field like that. I think that's a perfect application earthbound for the
Hmm.
emergency beam out. We're losing containment on something, water's coming in. Let's get these people, back on the surface.
Yeah, yeah. And so the value of life, like a lot of times we send our, this always bothers me about like these futuristic shows. You take your best and brightest people, and this is a Bones thing to say. You take your best and brightest, you seal them into like, a ship in the vastness of space, and you send them out there
Right.
like they're irreplaceable.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
These
these
people,
people work for years to get into Starfleet. They've got hella experience, and the first thing you're going to do is shoot them out light years to confront hostile aliens. So,
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
it's crazy to me.
yeah,
Like the Ahuras and all that stuff. Like, so yeah, I think that this would definitely be like a game changer for how, but then there's that reliance. So I understand like it would, people, I think people are more likely to take risks and to do, it's kind of like taking the safeties off. Or there's a great scene with Picard, I think, when his son or whatever, then he goes mountain climbing, and he's like, you take your safeties off? He's like, yeah,
yeah.
because you can, so there's a difference in how they
Right,
approach things in
right.
those.
But someone who's always been afraid to do something like base jumping or sports that are kind of high risk, that's taking a lot of the fear and anxiety out of that. You're able to live a more freer existence again without that apprehension.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay. Next point.
Here we go. So, our next point is you're able to speed up the movement of equipment and specialists required for global projects,
Hmm.
fast tracking progress with near instantaneous reach of materials and personnel. And this was a point that you had come up with, which I really loved the
Thanks.
idea. No, really, the ability to move equipment, to move personnel from place to place, to build housing,
Mhm.
think stuff as mundane as that, to be able to build out replicating facilities. And we're going to get to that technology later on in our discussions, but
Definitely.
whatever it is you need, right? Logistics, basically, this point says, are not as complex as they used to be when you have something like a transporter. And that would make a massive difference to the
Yeah.
people of Earth.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, I totally agree, and thank you. But just imagine like you're in Mumbai or in New Delhi. I'm picking India, whatever. But like,
Yeah.
let's say you're in China or France or Egypt, and there's a project like under the sea or something in the Pacific Ocean, and suddenly you're like, okay, well, we're going to transport in a
Yeah.
shelter, and then you just start going. You don't even need the ships. You can just transport them right down to the bottom of the ocean. Like, so there is a your cartography, the way that you move around the planet would change. The way you can fundamentally move material and personnel would change. I think people will become more ambitious and audacious as they took
Oh,
more and
yeah.
more risk. Yeah,
Oh,
and
yeah.
and you know, oh well, this lithium is in Afghanistan. Well, we need it in South America. Well, immediately needs to be moved. So instead of waiting weeks for ships or whatever, it's just It's just there. It's just part of your
Instantaneous.
inventory. Yeah. So the world becomes an inventory rather than a specific geolocation.
And you're
Um,
able to get assets and resources to people who need it, because currently we're living in a world where there's abundance in some places and scarcity in others, and the logistics and the economics of bridging the gap between the two always holds us back. But again, with this theoretical device, the transporter in Star Trek,
yeah.
those two things are instantly aligned, and you can meet needs wherever you have to on the planet instantaneously.
It's so true. It would really change how I think the transporter would definitely, that the first point about having like a global city, I think that would just fundamentally change like how you moved about everything, and like whatever you were, whether you're a doctor, whether you're an engineer, whether you're someone who's like specialized in working with pieces of machinery, you're never far away from just instantaneously being near the others who would help you with that. Like suddenly you have like a specialist in like the Antarctic or whatever, you're immediately consulting with them, not just in a video way. Like you're just
Right.
going and
You're
seeing
going to
their,
see them.
yeah,
Because as much as Zoom has been a breakthrough for us in terms of video conferencing and all that kind of stuff, it's still a little unnatural, right? To look
yeah,
at
yeah,
people on a screen. I mean, if you could actually beam to that person and communicate your idea that way, that's
yeah.
the best way to do it. That's how humans are hardwired through evolution to sort of
That's
socialize with each other.
that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. I'm gonna move on to the next one here. Take us away.
Yeah. This one is a little esoteric. So for those of you out there who are not familiar with Star Trek technology, this is a particular type of transporter, the subquantum transporter, which has this theoretically unlimited range. And it's a device that we saw explored in the Enterprise series of Star Trek way back in the early 2000s. So, this device, as it was theorized in this episode, would radically alter the nature of space exploration. And the creator of the device really saw it as a way of, well, we wouldn't need ships anymore. We wouldn't need to send our best and brightest out into the darkness and danger of space. We could literally beam a person from Earth, San Francisco,
Mm-hmm.
to an ice cutter on Andoria, because
Right.
of the theoretical unlimited range of this device. Which I was like, if you push this transporter idea to its almost illogical extreme, then no corner of the universe is you're not locked out from any corner of the universe.
In a way, it reminds me of the Iconian Gate.
Yes,
The
yes.
you know. So I would say that you know, in the game, I don't know if you've ever played the Star Trek Online game. They have like a, the plot and stuff like. They'd really go into Iconians and the
Oh
bluegill
yeah, oh
monster.
yeah. I've put my fair share of time in the game.
Oh wow, okay. To me, that was the most interesting part of the game. I never played it, but I really just, I mean, eventually, I want to just get into how the plot in the game actually, because it's official, right? So, I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
it's
It,
canon, right?
well, I mean, canon to the folks who are sharing in the community of gaming within it, So, and some
Fascinating.
ideas from the games have made it into the TV shows and at
Really?
least the novels. So,
Oh, for sure.
yeah,
That's cool.
canonicity is there.
Okay, so the idea of this transporter, um, it's a lot of power.
Right.
It's a lot. It's a lot of power. It's a lot. This is really a high level sort of thinking, and um, if you no longer needed ships and crews and you could just go anywhere, there's an episode of Voyager that comes to mind with the Vaudoir, where they use these corridors. They wake them
Oh,
up after a
yes,
long
yes.
sleep, and they just go right back to like colonizing,
Right.
and being
You
like
wake them up
warlike.
after what was it, a millennium that they
Okay,
had
yeah.
been awake,
Hmm.
and then they immediately start looking for their corridors. But transportation is still a thing in the Star Trek world. So we've solved it in terms of transporters, in terms of bridging vast distances, but it's really genius about Star Trek that we still have the problems of today, but on a larger scale, right? So it's like we can get from Australia to New York in a couple of seconds now, but how do I get from Earth to Vulcan? And
Right.
this was one of those devices that said, we're going to try to lower the risk of people traveling at high warp, equipment that fails. Not everything is flawless in Star Trek in terms of its technology. It certainly is more than advanced than we are today. But the subquantum transporter is just a means of unlimited range in terms of traveling all over the galaxy to another galaxy. It's a radical idea, and for those of us who love science fiction, it is just endlessly wondrous to think about.
It's as profound to me as, and I know that, let's look at an on-screen version in Discovery with the mycelium network. Just like pop
Right.
in and out, and I mean, that was a lot of people didn't like that order, but I loved it. I love that there was like something that, like, because it actually mirrors the idea of spooky action at a distance. There is a real world postulate that Einstein disliked but had to deal with, was the quantum entanglement.
Yes.
And this could actually be explained by quantum entanglement. Every electron in the universe has an infinite cloud. They don't say that, think of it just being around it, but it's technically infinite. The probability doesn't drop off to the rest of the universe. And so using that mathematics, you could say, well, you're just locating to the edge of some like electron cloud. It's very real. This is not a nonsense proposal. It's very possible that this could actually be in some super far theoretical future or whatever, but the ramifications of it, I can't even begin to describe what it would be like to just show up on a planet and then just take over. I think that was the problem with the Iconians as well.
Right.
Just showed up and then just took over. So
they became conquerors overnight once they had the gate technologies.
What would that do to us?
Who knows? It might open up avenues of exploration, which is what Star Trek says about humanity in the future. But in the hands of another species, you might get, you might have a whole galaxy conquered in a matter of days.
Yeah. Okay. Now the last one, I believe.
Yeah. So transporter technology can be used to store converted matter for extended periods of time in the Star Trek universe without significant degradation to that matter. So again, if you're new to Star Trek and you're new to the idea of a transporter, when that organic matter is energized or transformed into energy, it gets stored in a buffer until you select a location in terms of which it is destined to go. And we've seen, even in recent episodes that I just watched of Strange New Worlds, the idea that you could hold organic matter in the buffer indefinitely, which again is just one of those game-changing ideas. There are a lot of applications for this, and we've seen it happen a couple of times in Star Trek, most famously with Captain Scott. Montgomery Scott from the original series on TNG. He makes a comeback because he'd been stored in a transporter pattern buffer for such a long period of time, 75 years spent in a buffer, and he was able to get around the degradation of his organic matter and by cycling and running this diagnostic, I think, over and over again to kind of check his integrity. Such a clever idea and such a beloved character. But, when you start to think about it and expand on that idea, he hijacked this theoretical technology to save his own life, to preserve his own life, when there was no life support on the Genosian, I think was the name of the ship.
Oh my God, well done.
I know, right? I need a I need a trivia credit for that. The Genosian. Yeah. And but I mean, you could use this just the way we think today, or rather in the 70s when cryogenics was a big thing and you have a brain tumor, an inoperable form of cancer. People were thinking, well, maybe you can slow down the activity through extreme cold, keep that person alive, but in suspended animation until science actually catches up with them and there's a novel cure for it. So holding people in the quote unquote transporter buffer indefinitely has medical applications. If there's just something that can't be addressed with the science of the day, you may at some point elect to store yourself in a buffer and kind of wait it out until there is a cure for whatever it is that ails you. So I thought that was interesting.
Super interesting. Super interesting. It actually brings to mind a couple things. One is, how would you liken this to stasis fields in terms of, what is one, what is the other?
That's interesting because and correct me if I'm wrong. You always need other Star Trek fans to keep you honest. But when you're in stasis, I think metabolic activity is slowed, but I don't think it is fully halted.
I don't
So
know.
theoretically, if you're in a stasis field, you might slowly begin to grow hair,
I see.
fingernails, and that kind of thing. So stasis probably represents a short-term solution,
Gotcha.
maybe months. It would be like putting maybe an orange in the refrigerator or a piece of fruit. It will last a lot longer than if it wasn't in the refrigerator, but eventually it I think the
Okay.
stasis sort of catches up with you. So, but the transporter buffer, having changed you into energy, having just stored the raw energy and some kind of a schematic in the buffer for how to
Mhm.
reintegrate or turn that energy back into matter, and that is what's so mind blowing about the transporter in general. Once you start to think about, wow, if we had one, you could use it in so many different ways. And I think storing people, even objects, if you just have unwieldy, heavy mechanical items that might not fit on a starship, you could theoretically put them in the buffer, hold them there, and then sort of expand them like a zip file when you get to your location.
That's brilliant. I wonder why they don't do that. I don't think they have the
Well,
flexibility,
they don't have
imagination.
me on the writing
That's
staff.
true.
It's like they don't have me in the writer's room. Lord Deathman, catch me on Twitter under the handle.
Yes. Oh my God. If you have that, I will totally spiff that in the comments for you. But so yes, the Montgomery Scott episode, which is so well done and such a
Yeah.
great fan service.
Oh, yeah.
I also thought about the episode of DS9 where they all had to be thrown into the buffer, and Eddington and Odo were trying to take them out, and then they rematerialized in the holodecks, the only place that had the
Right.
data requirements. So what comes to mind to me is like these enormous data compressors and data buffers that are required to store the entire energy pattern of like one human being must be also enormous. The computing power like necessary just to hold that. So again, one small misstep in that
Yeah.
cycle or that pattern, you've lost it. And we've seen in TNG often where buffer degradation will
Yeah,
lose
it's a
you.
thing that happens. Yeah. Or your discriminators that analyze the organic matter before it gets converted don't have enough resolution, or that they don't filter out some contaminant, and then what you get on the other end is not what you started with, sometimes to
Right.
horrific effect.
Sure. But it is effectively a type of time travel if you do it
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
So you basically move to the future.
You could. And even if you're just like, well, I like utopia, I like the 24th century on Earth, but I wonder what the 30th century is going to look like.
Wow.
If you don't have those familial ties, you don't have any, connections, it's theoretically possible that you might want to lock yourself up in a buffer and kind of wait it out till you
Yeah.
can see what the future looks like.
And maybe save someone's life if as again you said, like a medical concern, like someone who wants to like maybe wait until like something is cured in the future for them, and really could save lives. And I bet a bunch of like historians would do it just to like
Yeah.
like we're gonna go and see, this is what we're gonna it's like going to Mars. You don't ever plan to come back, but
Right. And
you go.
in your biology being a snapshot of the time you were born in, and if you waited out a couple of centuries, I mean, the people of the future kind of have this curiosity in you that you, from an anthropological standpoint, represent early man.
Totally. Okay, I'm now. Oh, there's still one more. Sorry.
Oh, wow. I think we have touched on this, but basically talking about
Yeah.
transporter technology, the medical applications. We've talked a lot about that. Gene editing and splicing. It becomes just quickly, you can kind of turn a transporter into an ad hoc genetic engineering device where if you want to take out certain parts of the structure, add new things to it. We've seen things get combined in transporters, but this was worth talking about because again, it's just one of those mind-blowing novel uses for transporter technology.
Yeah. I mean, in the current paradigm. We are working, like, I'm a genetics guy, and we're using the Cas9 protein to, like, possibly eventually filter out actual inborn disorders. So, like, we can go in vivo in, like, actual cells and program the cell now using this amazing technology to, like, say, well, I'm going to edit out all the genes for Huntington's. This is
Right.
an inborn disorder. You're born with it. It's in every single cell, but it's also a Mendelian trait. It's an on or off sort of thing. I can go in and edit it out in vivo in every one of your cells. You'll no longer have
That's
Huntington.
incredible. That's mind blowing, the kind of work you guys do. I cannot wait for this future. I hope I live to
Yeah,
see it.
it's crazy that they're doing it now, like in cells and stuff like that. They're starting to do some animal research with it, but it's been around since 2009, and they use it in classrooms. Like it's a great episode of, like, Enterprise, where they go to the future like 900 years with Archer and Daniels, and he's like, you learned how to time travel in high school? He's like, yeah. Like,
Right,
you
right.
know,
He learned
it's
the equations in like middle school or something like
yeah,
that. I remember that.
it's the same thing where you now, like, well, like, I did genetics in 2000 to 2004. I have to keep up, like, to whatever, and they will now. Then you get kits and stuff like, and you can buy these kits
Yeah,
to, like,
yeah,
do this stuff at home. So the tabletop, or, like, bench work of, like, the future will be stuff like this, where you can just, I'm gonna filter out okay, boys and girls, this rat has a cancerous tumor. It's messed with its DNA. Clean it up. Go
yeah,
fix it.
yeah.
Go, that'll be an assignment that some grade 11 has to do at, like, midnight, and has to,
Yeah, I'm going to cure cancer.
yeah,
I'm only in the ninth grade, but I
yeah.
got this.
So gene editing is, I mean, it's technically possible now, although not, like, the bioethics are still muddy on that. And but for biofiltering specifically, let's say you have, like, a toxin, like a poison, like, now we need, like, anti-venoms and anti-poisons to get those things out of your systems. Imagine you get transported to the hospital, and while you're in the buffer, they just filter it out.
Yeah, yeah. Incredible.
Yeah. Okay, so those have been some of the positive
Yeah.
ramifications to
Now we're going to the dark side.
dark side.
Indeed. So yeah, I will start us off here with talking about our first downside of transporter technology. I kind of posited the idea that it might make crime more challenging to investigate and prosecute. And again, we go back to the idea of a global city, your ability to be at 9 or different locations in a day, depending on whatever your allocation or ration of transporter credits are. Now, this touches on the idea that there may be a kind of surveillance state in this utopia, which is logging every single transport that you make. But
Hmm.
let's put that aside for a second because it feels like a different conversation. But if you were able to hijack the logging mechanisms and no one really knew where you moved from one instance to the next in a transport, you could wake up, decide that you want to commit a violent crime in Australia. You could commission that crime, then get on a transporter pad and again be somewhere else, maybe even in orbit, on a
Yeah.
space station. So it came to me that wow, with enough know-how, I guess in this future, it could make investigating crimes more possible because you have a population that's constantly in flux and moving all over the planet. But what do you think about that, Manny?
There's an episode where Picard not fakes his death, but, like, there's a crew that fakes his death so that he can go off and do some anthropological work as an undercover agent, whatever. And they think he's died, and they proceed as if he's died,
Right. I remember
right?
that.
And the energy signature was one that it could have been a weapons fire, so they assumed they had died, but it was really a transporter signal. That was
Right.
really interesting to me. That in this future of crime, that you could mask one to be the other, that we couldn't discriminate between those two things. So there was I can't remember, a teacher of mine who told me once that as the world becomes more safe or whatever, the technologies to counter it with fraud will always be commensurate. So
Right.
as become more, have more and more of these technologies, people will always monkey around and figure out some way to bypass or change it or whatever in some way. And so I think it will be very real.
Yeah.
And even though I think that there is a sort of utopian sort of, paradise sort of veneer that, oh, this doesn't happen on Earth. Pleasure planets or paradise
Right.
planets, they don't have them, because their technology, it is a security myth that, nothing ever happens here. But if someone really put their mind to it, I think that those systems are subverted much more easily than people
Might
realize
think,
in
yeah.
that universe.
Especially if you're in a utopia and you've been lulled into the idea that you are safe. And I'd like to believe I'm much more optimistic and humanistic in the idea that I think we would have reached a level of emotional maturity where there would be less aberration in terms of the transgressive mind. But at
Yeah,
the same time, those transgressive ideas that come from human beings are the reason we innovate. They're the reason that we push ourselves further, but they're going to be misused. I think in lower numbers is what I'm saying, which would make
yeah,
the vast majority of our populace safer. But there's
yeah,
always going to be a hacker out there,
yeah.
who wants to abuse something.
It's totally true. I think you hit it on the head. I think you'll reduce the number of those things because, I mean, I think the motivations for crime, a lot of them are desperation, and there's the inequality of society leads to a lot of crime.
Right.
So the actual criminal acts become more common in a society where there's inequality, but the actual number of like intended criminals in society that's like more equal, maybe less because there's less inequity and
Right.
like
Less
the
scarcity.
motivation.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not truly nefarious; they're just desperate.
Right.
Uh, um, yeah, so that's sort of what I think. I agree with you that, but the investigation and prosecution of those things. There's an episode of Enterprise where they go to the Vulcan planet, and the Commodore gets blown up at like this conference. He dies, and
Oh, yes. Yes. I recall that episode. Yeah. It was at the Vulcan embassy.
yeah,
Yeah.
Vulcan
Yeah.
embassy, the Earth embassy on Vulcan, and
Right.
yeah. So then they investigated and stuff, and it's a conspiracy, and they didn't have they figured, oh, the humans don't have the technology to
Right. To solve
investigate this
this crime.
properly,
Yeah.
but Saval helps them, and he's
Yeah.
like, so that's also some of the things that you in the Star Trek world you have to kind of depend on good intentions for
Yeah.
plot points to sort of connect with them. So yeah, I do think it will be like much more challenging to investigate. I think I think people capitulate in a Star Trek world, so the prosecution of those things, because they know that in Starfleet or in the Federation that they go easy on the criminals. They're really
Right.
not. Yeah. So I think that I actually don't know much about their legal system, to be honest.
And they keep that a little vague in the Star Trek world, to be fair.
Yeah.
But I thought of the Edge case where, how can you say it was me that hit that guy over the head with the club because there were like 1,300 simultaneous transports during that millisecond, and now eventually someone can go through a log and kind of figure it out. But I say it'll be harder to prosecute because someone's actually going to have to do that work of like, okay, it was,
Right.
I have to eliminate this 100,000 and look at now I'm left with a subset. And while you're doing that, I'm sure your free roaming criminal is planning his escape to Ryza
That's
or
right.
someplace else.
That's so true. That's so true. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm gonna move on to the next
Sure.
point here. Take it away.
Yeah. So one of the downsides of transporters, are a ramification, I think, on human society from a metaphysical perspective. It introduces these kinds of quandaries surrounding the idea that you've technically been disintegrated and then reintegrated. So I thought, that there would be a lot of thought experiments that kind of sound like, was I killed when I was transformed into energy? And then a copy of me was made at another location. Famously, this idea is not one that I originated. It really comes from the very first Star Trek novel that was written in 1970 by a gentleman by the name of James Blish. And the title of that novel was, or is, Spock Must Die, with an exclamation mark at the end of it. And it kind of posits a scenario in which Spock is actually duplicated during a transport. A copy of him is made instead of moving him to the next location, which kind of introduces, again, this metaphysical quandary of what actually happens to me when I'm inside of a transporter, what takes place. It only takes a millisecond to happen, but did I die and was I sort of reconstituted? And I think a lot of people might not want to use a transporter for that very reason, to kind of keep the sanctity of their bodily integrity intact, not because they're technophobes or Luddites, but because really the thought experiment of it, no matter how common it is for people to transport on a daily basis, you're probably wondering, what happens in the matter stream,
Apparently, Barclay's matter stream had like these stuff
Right.
like floating around. That's funny.
Yes, we're going to get to that, I think, in another point. But yeah, that falls right into this category: psychosis around transporting. We're still going to be human, is the idea, and we're still going to have those psychological limits, even if we do get over those, physical barriers.
So the roots of all of this specifically is in philosophy. These are old thoughts, experiments. Star Trek often draws from the real world things. And there's even an episode of Enterprise where that same guy in the wheelchair, the father of all transportation, says at that dinner when he's with Archer, and he's like, and all that nonsense with people saying that you destroyed them in one place. And so they quickly glossed over the entire debate because they didn't want to go into it in that episode, but they acknowledged it. And it's it's a very real thing in philosophy. Do you have to destroy the original matter to imprint it into the buffer and then 3D print it again? Like basically to print it again.
Right.
So here's my take. I think that, because I obviously don't know, both are possible. I think that both it's possible to have like the disintegration, reintegration, where you are not yourself, where that Hugh Jackman movie is the same way, where you kill the original and then the new guy comes out. Do you know what I'm talking?
Right. That was The Prestige.
The Prestige,
yeah.
Yes. Are you still the original and so forth? And you have so many copies of a copy of a copy that even the smallest difference you could say. But the truth is that we are not static beings. We're always changing.
True.
And, maybe there's like a natural way in which we're doing it. And then maybe there's like an unnatural way that suddenly you've interrupted the natural course, or you've changed some base pairs in your body, or some biochemistry is off, some brain chemistry something is off, where it's not the exact same
version
thing,
of you, right?
So that I would say that the other way that I would picture it is at a quantum level. If you suspend out of time, if by creating this, you're actually suspending it out of time, then you are actually the same person who's popped back into reality, because you've been taken out of this universe completely. And so this is another way that I think about it. And in the same way that electrons and photons can just randomly pop into our universe or pass between universes, I believe, because of the duality or nature of like how particle physics works, that the way that transporters work and this way that subspace works or whatever, that is actually a suspension. That the idea that it's in a data buffer is just weird to me, that it's actually some sort of computer holding the pattern to draw you back. But I believe that the actual pattern or fit of whatever thing it is actually suspended outside of time and space and then brought back into time and space.
And you lose the apparatus of consciousness when you get transformed into energy. So you can't contemplate, you have no concept of time when the conversion happens. So I think probably a lot of the trepidation is even in that instant where nothing, this whole infinity of doubt sort of exists in that millisecond. And for me, I kind of resolved the conflict by saying, does it really matter? Does it really matter if I'm destroyed in one place and recreated in another place? Some people would be like, well, maybe this is a pro-life thing and we shouldn't be killing anyone, no matter how quickly it happens, and the fact that there's no consequence for it. But I think if you are being disintegrated or killed in one place and then sort of resurrected in another, the scales kind of balance each other, and the goal is still sort of met. So I kind of ended at least my own metaphysical sort of labors on that myself with the technology. But it is a thing. And the
Mm-hmm.
name of the character who invents the transporter in the Star Trek universe is Emery Erickson.
Wow. Good for you.
Just it just came to my mind. Yeah.
Respect. Respect. I really love that episode because there's so much fan service. For me, it's like, you're also seeing like the transition. It's the same reason I loved seeing garbage cans in bathrooms on Enterprise. Like they weren't always polished. I
Right.
love. There's a great scene with Fox, so he just opens a garbage can and drops it. I'm like,
Yeah. Just a piece of
where was
trash.
everyone else? Yeah, like
Yeah.
and I love that. And so having someone there who like had an actual hand in like the changing technology of how that future was working. It's like, well, there's this fundamental new technology. Here's the guy who made it and how he
Right.
made so I love that whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have transporter psychosis.
Psychosis. Yeah, we just touched on this one. It's there is this an episode of TNG that is incredibly famous with the guest star Reg Barkley, who is a lieutenant who suffers from all manner of phobias. And he, in this episode, adds one more phobia to the list in terms of transporter phobia. He is one of the people on the planet Earth, even though transporter technology is widespread and popularly used, he is one of those individuals that feels that there's something unnatural about the transporter. And even though there's nothing mechanically wrong with the device, even though there's nothing physically wrong with him after a transport, he has a mental disorder, a literal psychosis that does not allow him to trust a transporter. He believes that it's a gateway to another universe, possibly a heaven or a hell type place. And it just so happens to coincide this episode, his psychosis or his phobia, with real entities that exist in the matter stream of the transporter. So the whole episode is kind of framed as him getting over this particular fear, which it's debatable if he ever does. But it just opened up the opportunity to talk about the technology and the fact that, I don't know if you'd agree, Manny, but there must be a small percentage of the populace on Earth that does suffer from transporter psychosis.
Yeah. Then what are the ethics involved in that, right? Like,
Yeah.
you have this technology that like helps like billions of people, but then you have a small percentage that will be irrevocably damaged by it.
Right.
We could say the same for cars and trains and modern transportation. So we have car crashes; they happen. We allow death. So I'm just and we also live in a time where our entire civilization depends on our ability to transport the way. And I would argue the same thing in that future that, and then that's why you have counselors and that's why you have all this medical treatment to like help people over this stuff. And I think within that episode, they're like, there hasn't been a documented case of transporter psychosis.
Yeah, in 50 years or something like that. It was like a few decades. So it does seem to be something that happens fairly rarely, but you have to really empathize with these fictional individuals because that limits their experience in the utopia. If you can't get into a transporter pad, I don't know if a good analogy is motion sickness or not being able to get on a plane, but the world is a big place for you. You've lost the idea of the global city. And it seems like the only way through transporter psychosis is through counseling.
You also famously have like characters like Pulaski, and I think Bones that just famously hated.
That distrusted.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they act so ruthlessly. They treat the transporter so poorly in their narratives that you would think that it's like, guys, it's been around for a century. Like, why are they upset about having to get on one? But yeah.
We have one last slide.
Indeed. So here we go. Transporter accidents may mean the loss of life. It can mean brutal disfigurements. Transporter accidents can also result in duplication, bifurcation, or merging of transported subjects. And that is one of the downsides of the transporter. So what you're dealing with a transporter is really individual patterns of energy that are based on an individual object or person. But if the discriminating technology that's supposed to keep those things separated is somehow hijacked, we have seen in Star Trek where two people can be combined into a single new being, or a single being can be bifurcated into two separate individuals as their pattern is copied imperfectly across those two copies of themselves. So transporter accidents are gnarly. We've seen Kirk go through one in the original series that famously separated his good side from his bad side, and he had to do that reconciliation. We've seen transporter accidents with Riker, where early on in his career as a lieutenant, he was being beamed off of a planet during an ion storm, and a copy of him was inadvertently left on the planet. And this was so sad and tragic to me when I saw that episode, because you have this juxtaposition of a Riker who was able to continue his life, his career, his relationships, advance in rank. All of those things were open to him as opportunities. But the version of him that was left on the planet that has these high level storms lived in, relative isolation, completely stagnant, took on a survivalist mentality, still had a great beard though. Still had a fantastic beard. But when the two of them are brought together to try and reconcile their lives, I was like, yeah, this has social ramifications sometimes, these type of accidents. But in the most basic example of a transporter accident, a pattern is just reassembled in a way that it just doesn't resemble the original. Sometimes you get an organic stew, a disfigured being that only lives a couple of seconds. But it's a thing, and we thought we should put it on this list. But Manny, what are your thoughts on these accidents?
In that episode with Scotty, where he's in the transporter buffer for like 75 years, and Geordi comes to work with him on it and stuff, and he shows him like the newer stuff, he makes a comment of saying, "Oh my God, your stuff is going to degrade." He's like, "No, we have these redundant buffers. It's it's totally different now. It's 80 years in the future. We got this." So even in Scotty's time, which is still like 100 years ahead of the Enterprise time, the transporter technology was getting better and better and better. So in the Enterprise days and in the TOS days, transporter accidents that were brutal and disfiguring were probably more common when you have like a gap in energy or something happens to the data transfer and stuff like that. In the TNG era, it's mostly safe. There are these wonderful memes of like Chief O'Brien just in the transporter room doing nothing like all the time.
It's playing so cards, because by then it's like
it's so
because routine. In the early days, you actually had to sort of regulate the energy flow manually with these switches, like these little riders that, it's like, oh, he's got to do that kind of real smooth. But I don't think you have to do that by the time you get to O'Brien's time, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah,
I believe so. It's just like a sort of on-off sort of thing where it just does that. In the new lower decks, they did that as well, where they did a bifurcation with Boimler. So the same Riker thing. So there's now two Boimlers in the lower decks one. Really funny that they made one have like a different personality, and he's still on the Titan, and then the other one goes back. So I mean, it's a funny trope. I really like it. The merging of transported subjects, the famous Tuvix episode.
Tuvix, one of our most controversial Star Trek episodes. Which side of the debate are you on, just out of curiosity? Are you for Tuvix, or are you thinking that it had to be Neelix and Tuvok?
I have a whole episode on this. Please go check it out on Opposite Treks called The Tuvix Problem. Awesome. Yeah, definitely check it out. What I would say is that there's two schools of thoughts for me, which is one, if you have the technology to bifurcate in the first place, make a copy of Tuvix and then separate one of them.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to have been. But when I brought this up with my cousin Mo, he said, well, that defeats the purpose of the philosophical problem. He's like, if you have a
it's a hack, right?
It's a hack. You basically, exactly. So let's say you actually only have like the Tuvix thing. I would come from a military perspective. It's the same reason that in the episode of Enterprise where they had to duplicate the chief engineer because they were like on a really intense mission. It's called simulation, or they call them simi. and they had to like grow basically a duplicate of the chief engineer and then kill him for like a part for
Right.
his brain. What is the ethics of creating like a
A
duplicate
life
just
that
to
you
kill him?
know is only going to last a short time. And to be clear on that, I don't think they murdered Simi. I think what happened is he was only going to live a short period of time. And then when he died, they were basically going to harvest his organs. But was it unfair to him to create him as a copy of another being, knowing that he would not live nearly as long and that he'd sort of have to go through this kind of psychological anxiety about
Yeah.
knowing that he was going to die?
I mean, these are going to be the ethical questions in that Star Trek world about transporter accidents, of course. And what about benign accidents that just, your toe didn't come through and we lost
Yeah.
the data stream, something like that.
Right.
So, where's liability? Where's, that sort of thing? And can you get it back? We have what is the loss of an arm if you can go to the doctor and get a new arm?
Yeah.
Is it really your arm? Do you care? Are you
Yeah.
inconvenienced? I don't know. Like we live that's the future that you live in, where you casually go get a new arm.
Right.
And so I think that it's definitely worth it for these things to happen. They're kind of cool. I bet these things don't happen on Vulcan ships.
Or if they do, the debates don't last as long, right?
Absolutely. It's a human thing to mess up like all these things. So
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Any last thoughts on this? I'm gonna put a pin in. It's been an hour on.
I know, on transporters. Well,
wow.
To wrap it up, this has been a fantastic discussion. I really
glad.
love drilling down into this kind of nitty gritty nerdy stuff when it comes to Star Trek. And it's again, if I were to close out and try to say something elegant that ties it all up in a nice bow, is that again, Roddenberry is just such a genius in terms of giving us a technological framework in Star Trek that allows for such a rich debate in terms of how the technology can be used for good or for evil, the types of social problems. So he gives you this piece of technology that you can write all these really incredible stories around. And I think that's the most important thing. But I think it's worth mentioning that the feasibility of a transporter, as Manny was just talking about earlier in the show, we're getting closer to it. We're going to get to the point where we can move a small piece of matter over a certain distance. So who knows? These actual speculations that we're talking about now might become real debates one day.
So cool. So cool. I can't wait to be in that future, man, and to have these ethical questions and quandaries and stuff. I'm sure it's going to be a rocky start, but if we did live in a world with transporters, we would be fundamentally changed as a people and as a species, and how we would move forward. And I think it would unite us in ways we can't even predict, like in the same way that you can't really predict how a cell phone or the internet or like modern conveniences, even the toaster or the microwave, like changed our lives so fundamentally. And then they just become like in the background, and you just take for granted that they're there. But we're talking to these magic rectangles that are like uniting us like across like huge distances. Imagine if I was really there. It's wild. So
Yeah, I mean, even 20, 25 years ago, these rectangles were just a dream in someone's mind.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me, man. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to the next time that we can catch up. Catch us next time on Trekker's Delight and Techno Trek. We'll be discussing replicators and their profound ramifications on human civilization.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for being here, Lord Deathman.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to replicators.
Now, again, I'm going to say this again because we're near the end of our show. If you are our allies, we are not talking to you. We are not talking to you. This does not... Okay? We're not talking to you. Stop trying to take our and make it your goddamn business. It ain't got nothing to do with you. It ain't got nothing to do with you.
Our experience of grief independently.
Bruh.
Yes.
I love that they're in the comments.
So much is like I'm just reading the comments.
Yeah. They should broaden their child out. It's such a good point, Will. God, that's such a good point. And he's really thought about it too. You should be here. William, get over here.
I thought he had a girlfriend on Insta. It's been ages since I've mucked about, but
Okay, moving on. Let's move on.
we gotta move on.